Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening a file on a concept that it sounds less like sound fiscal policy and more like financial science fiction.
Right.
We're talking about the death of property tax.
Right. For decades, this has been, the third rail of local government funding.
Mm-hmm.
Homeowners hate it, but it pays for everything from schools to fire protection.
And for a lot of people, the idea of getting rid of it is the ultimate economic fantasy.
It absolutely is. I mean, imagine you've paid off your home, no mortgage, and then on top of that, no annual rent that you're paying to the government.
That's the dream.
That's the dream. It's this concept of ultimate financial freedom, and it's moving incredibly fast from, the political fringes right into the heart of the 2026 ballot box.
Exactly. We're seeing these proposals pop up everywhere. Texas, North Dakota, Florida. It's a huge political shift. But our mission today isn't to, cheer for abolition. We're conducting a forensic investigation into the structural integrity of these plans.
Because there's always a catch. When a revenue source this massive just disappears, you have to ask what comes next. There's no such thing as a free lunch, especially with government revenue.
Right. That $5,000, $10,000, even $20,000 property tax bill might vanish.
Yeah.
But the schools, the fire department, all the municipal services, they still need to be funded. That money has to be replaced.
It has to come from somewhere.
So our central forensic question today is simple, but it's incredibly high stakes. If the government stops taxing your home, who exactly do they tax instead? This isn't just a policy debate. It's a high-stakes game of who pays.
And we're going to do a deep dive into the whole story, the history of this tax, why it even exists, and then break down the three really distinct and frankly dangerous proposals trying to replace it. There's a smart money trap hidden in these alternatives that might make you, the homeowner, wish you had the old system back.
The tone of this whole investigation really has to be careful what you wish for. All right, let's open the file on this and trace the motive for the murder of this tax. To really get why the political demand for this is so intense right now, we have to go back. We need to ground ourselves in why this tax exists at all. It didn't just, appear out of thin air.
That's right. And the property tax we know today is actually just a shadow of its former self. It started in the 1800s as something called the general wealth tax.
General wealth tax. That sounds much broader than just a tax on your house.
Oh, it was. It's a crucial distinction. It was essentially a tax on everything you owned. Anything that contributed to your overall economic status was, in theory, on the table.
So if you look at the old ledgers from that era, the local tax collector wasn't just measuring your land.
No, not at all. They were interested in a much broader inventory. They were valuing your livestock.
How many cows you have.
How many cows, how many horses did you have a prize bull? They were assessing your farm equipment, your carriages, your wagons. And they were even trying to value truly portable personal wealth. Things like silver, corporate bonds, stocks, and even items like gold watches or expensive jewelry.
That sounds like an absolute bureaucratic nightmare to administer. I mean, even for a simple rural economy back then.
It was incredibly cumbersome.
So what was the point? Why was the system necessary?
Well, its function was foundational. It was the only reliable mechanism local governments had to fund themselves. You have to think about the infrastructure of the early 19th century.
Okay.
There was no widespread federal income tax, no state sales tax like we have today. So if a local government needed to, say, pay for a sheriff or maintain a dirt road or build a one-room schoolhouse,
They had to get the money from the people who live there.
they had to tax the tangible existing wealth within their jurisdiction. And taxing physical assets was the most logical, even if it was a huge headache, solution in a pre-modern financial world.
But economies evolve. The 1800s gave way to the industrial age, the financial booms of the 1900s, and suddenly wealth became, a lot easier to move around. It got more liquid.
And that's exactly where the general wealth tax started to systemically break down.
Because of enforcement.
Entirely because of enforcement. Think about it. The tax collector could easily walk onto your farm and count the heads of cattle in your pasture.
Right.
They could assess the value of the barn you just built.
Yeah.
But as financial markets developed, it became, frankly, laughably simple to hide wealth.
How so?
You could sell your cows, take that cash, put it into corporate bonds, and just like that, you've made that capital effectively invisible to the local assessor.
You can put stock certificates in a safe deposit box. You can't exactly put a 3-story house or a working farm in a safe deposit box.
And that is the pivotal moment. That's the entire reason the system changed. Real estate is, by definition, an immovable asset.
You can't hide it.
it is impossible to hide from the assessor. So states just recognized this massive flaw in collection. They realized they were missing the vast majority of personal wealth, the stocks, the bonds, the cash, but they were catching 100% of the land and the buildings.
So they just gave up on the hard part.
They did. Slowly, state by state, they abandoned the impossible task of taxing stuff, all that portable property, and focused almost entirely on the one thing that could not move, the real estate.
And that's the pivot. That's what created the property tax system that we all live under today.
It went from this very broad tax on all wealth to a very specialized tax on fixed, real assets.
And this system, with all its controversies, it basically worked for decades, until it hit a breaking point that wasn't about tax rates, but about inflation and really bad timing.
Now we're talking about the crisis trigger of the 1970s. This is where the motive for the current political murder of the tax really comes from. The post-World War II economic stability just eroded. It turned into this intense, prolonged period of inflation. And because the government had so successfully targeted the immovable asset, the home, as the main source of local revenue,
Any rapid increase in the value of that home.
immediately translated into a rapid increase in the tax bill.
Home values, which were often assessed every year or every few years, were suddenly doubling, sometimes tripling in a really short period.
Right. And since property taxes are just a percentage of that assessed market value, the tax bill doubled or tripled right along with the valuation.
And what makes this so politically explosive is the human cost. This wasn't a tax on your income.
No, that's the key. It was a tax on unrealized paper wealth.
And the main anecdote, the one that still drives the narrative today, is the image of longtime homeowners, often elderly people living on fixed Social Security incomes.
They were asset-rich, but cash-poor.
Precisely. Their house was suddenly worth a fortune, but they weren't earning any new income. They owned $1 million home, but they only had maybe $2,000 a month to live on. They couldn't generate the cash to pay a sudden $20,000 tax bill.
Exactly. The shock wasn't just financial. It was existential. Imagine you get a tax bill in the mail that is suddenly 4 times what it was last year.
Just because the house down the street sold for a high price.
Right. And this led directly to people facing this horrifying choice. Sell the home you've lived in for 50 years or face foreclosure from the county. They were quite literally being taxed out of their homes.
And that political firestorm is what gave birth to the famous tax revolt of 1978.
In California's Proposition 13,
Right.
Prop 13 was the political pressure release valve. It didn't eliminate the tax, but it imposed 2 really severe constraints. It capped the actual tax rate, and more importantly, it capped the annual increase in a home's assessed value to just 2%.
So inflation couldn't just create these massive, sudden tax hikes anymore.
It was a lid on the boiling pot.
Okay, so 1978 was about capping the tax, controlling the growth. But if that pressure valve was installed, why are we back here? Why are we seeing demands for complete abolition now? What broke in the last few years?
The pressure cooker is back, and it's hotter than ever. The primary cause is the massive, rapid real estate appreciation we saw during the post-pandemic housing boom.
Coupled with general inflation.
Right. So even systems that have caps, like Prop 13, have seen their maximum tax burdens reach levels that are just untenable for a lot of people, especially in hot markets.
So voters are watching this cycle repeat itself.
They are, and they're demanding a more extreme solution. They're basically saying, the cap didn't go far enough. We want the state to take its hands off our home completely.
They want to murder the tax entirely. And that sets the stage for the 3 experiments we see today.
Okay, so the political pressure is immense. The promise of zero property tax is just too appealing for politicians to ignore. Now, let's get into the critical examination of the 3 main models being tested across the U.S. to do this. We need to focus on the mechanics and the immediate flaws of each one.
Let's start with Model 1, which really serves as a cautionary tale. This is the warning shot from North Dakota.
North Dakota's Measure 4. This was on the ballot in November 2024, and it was the pure abolish everything approach.
It was. The proposal was for the complete, total, and immediate abolition of property tax across the entire state. No phase-in, just gone.
And the verdict from the voters.
A resounding failure. It was defeated decisively. And that failure is maybe the single most important forensic finding for anyone who supports the idea of pure abolition.
Why? Because the voters who you'd think would want this saw the flaw.
They saw the immediate glaring flaw. The math simply did not work. They were trying to remove a pillar that provides, what, about $3 billion in revenue in North Dakota every year?
About $3 billion, yeah. And the proposal offered no robust, clear, or stable plan to replace that money.
So the voters looked at this massive hole in the budget.
The voters played the smart money game. They looked at that enormous revenue gap, and they correctly concluded that abolishing the tax without a replacement plan would instantly trigger one of two things:
Massive cuts to services.
police, fire, and especially schools. Or it would force the state to implement an even more draconian replacement tax down the road. They decided the cure was worse than the disease.
So the lesson from North Dakota is pretty clear. Pure abolition without an ironclad replacement plan is just a recipe for fiscal chaos. It's a political non-starter.
It is. But there's a deeper consequence here, too, that relates to local control.
What do you mean?
Well, you have to recognize the principle that control follows the money. Local entities, your municipal governments, library boards, fire districts, and especially your local school boards
They all rely on that local property tax revenue.
to maintain their autonomy.
Yeah.
If the state capital is suddenly responsible for generating all $3 billion to backfill those services, your local school board loses all its power, all its discretion.
So decisions about curriculum, teacher salaries, spending priorities.
They all migrate to the centralized state government. It fundamentally alters the nature of local democracy.
That's the ultimate irony, isn't it? You eliminate the tax to give people more freedom, but you end up eliminating their local decision-making power in the process.
Precisely.
Okay, that brings us to Model 2, which actually tries to solve that revenue problem head-on. This is Florida's consumption swap.
Which is hiding what we're calling the 20% sales tax trap.
So what's the proposal here?
The Florida model is built on a very attractive premise: a direct tax swap. Eliminate property tax entirely for residents, and then replace that lost revenue with a significantly higher and expanded sales tax.
And the political slogan, especially in a state like Florida, is incredibly potent.
Oh, it's brilliant marketing. Let the tourists pay for our roads.
They want to shift the burden onto visitors who are, consuming goods and services while they're in the state.
It taps into this idea of exporting your tax liability. It sounds fantastic. But we have to look past the slogan and focus on the forensic math.
And this is where it falls apart for a lot of analysts.
It is, because to replace the vast amount of revenue generated by property taxes, which can be tens of billions of dollars in a big state, the required sales tax rate would need to hit an astronomical level.
You mentioned 20%. How do you even get to a number that high?
Well, you have to look at the tax base. Property tax revenue is based on the total value of all real estate in the state.
Ah,
That's a massive, stable, and generally appreciating number.
okay.
Sales tax, on the other hand, is only applied to the value of taxable goods and services that people consume. It's a much narrower base.
So let's say a state generates $40 billion a year from property taxes, and their current sales tax, maybe 6 or 7%, only brings in $20 billion.
You've got a massive gap to fill. And to make up that difference, you don't just have to raise the rate dramatically. You often have to expand the sales tax to include things that are currently exempt.
Like what?
Services, haircuts,
Yeah.
legal fees, landscaping, certain types of groceries. By the time you do the modeling to capture all that replacement revenue, the rate required on that new expanded base could realistically hit 18, 20, or even higher in some high-cost states.
20%. We need to make that tangible for people listening. What does a 20% sales tax actually mean for an average family's budget?
It means buying any durable good becomes a luxury event. You go to buy a $40,000 new car, you are immediately paying $8,000 in sales tax just to drive it off the lot.
Wow, that's a down payment.
It could have been down payment.
Yeah.
If you're replacing a refrigerator or a washing machine, you're adding hundreds, maybe thousands in immediate cost.
And this hits essential consumption too. Even if some food is exempt, it hits clothing, utility services, home repairs.
It radically shifts the cost of living. The rationale is to tax consumption and encourage investment, but the real consequence is that residents who consume regularly, which is every middle and low-income family, bear the overwhelming burden.
It's a high hidden cost.
And it disproportionately impacts those who have to spend the largest percentage of their limited income just to survive. The person who saves and invests benefits immensely. The person who has to spend everything just to live is severely penalized.
So the Florida model solves the revenue problem by trading a tax on wealth for a highly regressive tax on consumption. And that could cause a whole new affordability crisis.
It absolutely could. And it raises that fundamental question of fairness. Should we penalize stability, which is owning, or activity, which is spending. The Florida model makes a very aggressive choice to penalize activity.
Okay, that brings us to the third model. The one our sources suggest is the stealth method, the most politically astute and probably the likely winner in the long run.
The Texas super exemption. What's so fascinating about the Texas model is that it isn't abolition. It's not a repeal. It's a very surgical use of an existing tax mechanism, the homestead exemption.
And they're leveraging huge budget surpluses to do it.
Primarily from oil and gas revenue, yes.
Yeah.
And they're using that to achieve near zero tax liability for the middle class without causing the entire state revenue structure to implode.
So let's break down how the homestead exemption works for listeners who might not have one.
It's pretty simple. The homestead exemption is just the portion of a primary residence's assessed value that's shielded from local property taxes.
So it's like a discount off the top.
Exactly. And in Texas, the state sets a minimum limit for that discount. Historically, that limit was pretty low, maybe $25,000, $40,000.
Oh, okay.
But in the last few years, because of these extraordinary state budget surpluses, legislators have dramatically increased that limit. It recently jumped to $100,000.
And now there are campaigns to push it even higher.
Much, much higher. There are serious, active political campaigns aiming to push that exemption to $500,000, maybe even $750,000.
So let's walk through the practical effect of that. If I own a home valued at $450,000 and the state passes a $500,000 exemption,
then your effective tax liability is zero. You technically still have a property tax law on the books, but you don't pay anything.
and that's the genius of the stealth method. It surgically protects the largest number of middle-class homeowners.
It does, but crucially, it doesn't destabilize local government funding. And here's the really important technical nugget. The state doesn't just eliminate the tax revenue. It uses its multi-billion-dollar surplus to send money back to the local governments.
To backfill what they lost.
To backfill the lost revenue from all those newly exempted homes. So the school districts, the municipalities, they're made whole.
So instead of creating a massive fiscal hole like in North Dakota, the Texas state government is essentially just subsidizing the middle-class homeowners' property tax bill, and they're using state funds from oil and gas to do it.
It turns the exemption into a state-funded subsidy. And commercial properties, expensive luxury homes, second homes, rental properties, all of those still pay their full share.
That maintains a big chunk of the revenue for local fire and police.
It does.
Yeah.
But it completely alleviates the political pressure from the most vocal and vulnerable group, the middle-class homeowner.
That does sound strategically superior. It keeps the mechanism working while solving the political problem. But isn't there a huge risk? Relying on massive but volatile oil and gas money to fund stable things like schools. What happens when the commodity market crashes?
And that is the core challenge. That's the skepticism we have to apply. You're absolutely right. Property tax, as unpopular as it is predictable. It's stable.
Real estate values are pretty steady locally.
They are. Oil revenue is hyper-volatile. So if a state commits to replacing billions in statal tax revenue with unstable, commodity-dependent revenue, they are absolutely setting themselves up for a major funding crisis during the next inevitable downturn.
It's politically brilliant in the short term.
But economically very risky in the long term.
Still, it offers a path forward that doesn't involve the shock of a sales tax swap or the chaos of pure abolition. It seems like it's positioned as the most balanced and therefore the likely winner among the three models.
For now, yes.
Yeah.
It's the path of least resistance.
We've now arrived at the core of our forensic analysis, the traps. The political appeal is just overwhelming when a politician says, we're going to eliminate property tax, but only on your primary residence.
Right. It sounds like an act of social justice. We're protecting shelter.
But that primary residence only distinction is where all three of these massive hidden risks come from.
It is. The immediate surface-level thinking is, okay, we protect the owner-occupier, but we keep the tax for landlords and businesses. That sounds fair. They're commercial enterprises, not basic shelter.
But that completely misunderstands how interconnected the housing market and the tax structure really are.
It fundamentally misunderstands it.
We have to look at this through that smart money lens and really investigate why just exempting the primary residence creates these economic distortions that can penalize the very people the system claims it wants to protect.
So let's start with risk number one. This is the one that's almost always left out of the political conversation.
The renter tax.
Renter tax.
And this is not a theoretical cost. It is an economic certainty.
Okay, so let's set up a comparison. Two neighbors. I'm a homeowner. I live in a nice house, And now, thanks to a super exemption, I pay $0 in property tax. That's a huge windfall for my monthly budget.
Right. But the massive 100-unit apartment complex right next door, the one owned by a corporation, it still has to pay a staggering unexempted property tax bill, let's say $1 million a year.
Okay.
What is the inevitable economic response from that landlord?
Well, the landlord has a simple, non-negotiable economic reality. For a large apartment complex, property tax is one of the biggest single operating expenses. It's second only to the mortgage payment itself.
It's a fixed cost of doing business.
It's a required cost. The landlord can't just absorb that $1 million cost. It has to be treated just like a utility bill or a maintenance expense. It gets factored directly into the rents that are charged to the tenants.
So the cost is transferred immediately, directly, and systematically to the renter. The renter is now paying a piece of that $1 million annual tax bill in their monthly rent.
Exactly. This creates an artificially cheap housing system for the homeowner, whose housing cost has been subsidized by the legislature.
While at the same time,
At the same time, it creates an artificially expensive system for the renter, who is now carrying a disproportionate share of the local tax burden. The tax burden doesn't disappear. It's just concentrated onto investment properties.
and those investment properties have a consumer, the renter, who has no choice but to pay.
They have no choice.
We are effectively creating a system where owning is subsidized by renting. My tax break as a homeowner is being paid for, in part, by the family renting the two-bedroom apartment next door.
That is a mechanism that will explosively widen the wealth gap. You're creating what you could call a permanent, politically imposed underclass of renters who are structurally mandated to subsidize the tax breaks of the property owning class.
It's a direct transfer of liability.
It is, and it makes the journey from renter to owner that much harder because their base living cost, their rent, is now inflated by a tax liability that the homeowner next door no longer has to face.
That is a staggering and almost completely invisible cost.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to risk number 2. This one is based on historical evidence from previous tax revolts.
The lock-in effect. This is where housing inventory just vanishes.
The logic here is simple, but it's devastating to the housing market.
It is. If the state gives me a tax-free or severely capped tax status on my primary home, that protection is tied to me and that specific property. Selling it becomes financially dangerous.
Explain that disincentive. Why would I not want to move?
Okay, imagine you've lived in your $400,000 home for 30 years under a zero-tax system. If you sell that home and try to move to an equivalent $400,000 home a few miles away, maybe to downsize, or be closer to a new job, that new home will be assessed at the current market rate.
I lose my protection.
You instantly lose your protected, tax-free status, and you face a brand new and potentially very high property tax bill.
So I'm financially trapped in my house. Even if my kids have grown up and moved out, and I want to downsize from a big 5-bedroom house to a small condo, the tax cost of moving makes the whole thing unaffordable.
And this is exactly what we saw happen in California after Proposition 13. It created what some call tax refugees, people locked into these specific favorable tax bubbles.
They just stopped moving.
They stopped moving. Inventory vanished from the market. Even when the owner needed to move for retirement, for health reasons, for a job change, the market becomes completely rigid.
And when inventory vanishes, what happens to housing prices for the next generation, for the people trying to get into the market for the first time?
Prices inevitably soar because supply dries up. The policy that was intended to grant financial freedom to current homeowners has the unintended consequence of crippling mobility, starving the housing market, and making it exponentially harder for young families to ever afford a home in the first place.
It's the ultimate example of be careful what you wish for.
It traps the existing owners, and it starves the overall market of supply for decades.
And finally, risk number 3, the business squeeze. This is the invisible bill, the one you think you avoided, but you end up paying every time you buy groceries or fill up your car.
This is the cost transfer from the housing sector to the consumption market. We already established that if homeowners, the largest group of local taxpayers, stop paying, the local government still has to fund schools, police, and roads. That revenue void must be filled.
And since the plan is to keep taxing businesses and landlords, they have to pick up the slack.
They do. Commercial property taxes have to skyrocket to cover the gap left by the residential exemptions. So think about the massive distribution centers, the local grocery stores, the factories, the small office buildings. Their tax rates go up dramatically.
And a business, whether it's a huge corporation or a small neighborhood hardware store, they just treat property tax as a non-negotiable input cost.
It's just like the cost of electricity or raw materials or employee wages. They don't just absorb that increased tax burden, they incorporate it into their pricing models.
So when the property tax bill for the local grocery chain's distribution center goes up by hundreds of thousands of dollars,
They simply raise the prices on the goods and services they sell to the public to cover that increased operating cost. They socialize the cost across their entire customer base.
so let's run the specific, tangible trade-off for someone listening. You, the homeowner, you advocated for this policy, and now you save $5,000 a year on your property tax bill. That feels like a massive win.
It does, but because of the skyrocketing commercial taxes, your local grocery store raises its prices by 3%. The local gas station raises its price per gallon. Your local pharmacy raises its
But
pricing.
over the course of a year, when you add up the increased cost of everything you consume, milk, gas, electronics, clothing, restaurant meals, you find you're spending an extra $5,000 a year in just those higher prices.
The outcome is fiscally neutral for your household. You still paid the tax.
You just don't see the bill. It's not itemized as property tax due on November 1st. It's hidden in the price of everything you buy.
You pay it through higher consumption costs. The system is designed to generate revenue. Eliminating one stream only guarantees that another stream has to rise to meet the need. This hidden cost is maybe the most insidious trap because it undermines a political promise entirely.
There is no such thing as a free lunch in this discussion. It's all just a shell game of who pays, when they pay, and how visible that cost is to the consumer.
So let's synthesize the findings of our forensic investigation. We've looked at the guaranteed fiscal chaos of North Dakota's pure abolition. We looked at the massive regressive consumption shock of Florida's potential 20% sales tax.
And the massive societal traps, the renter tax, the lock-in effect, the business squeeze, that are created by only exempting primary residences.
Right.
The central unavoidable finding here is that eliminating a stable revenue source like property tax, it's not about saving money, it's about shifting the cost.
The government will always get its revenue. The only debate is how they get it and from whom they take it.
And based on our analysis of the technical risks and the political viability, the verdict seems to lean pretty heavily toward the Texas super homestead exemption, that it's the most realistic and economically survivable path.
I think so. For states that are trying to respond to this tax revolt pressure, it seems to be the one.
So why do we designate it as superior to the other two more dangerous options?
Because it's a surgical solution, not a nuclear option. It addresses the exact political pain point, which is the middle-class homeowner, without requiring the wholesale detonation of the stable local funding mechanism.
By just dramatically raising the exemption limit.
Right. You provide massive relief to the majority of voters who are politically agitated, but you keep the tax base intact on commercial properties, on investment real estate, and on high-value luxury homes.
It's practical, it's politically feasible, and crucially, it seems to minimize the major systemic shocks, like the lock-in effect and that explosive renter tax that pure abolition would guarantee.
It addresses the grandma being taxed out of her home problem without simply transferring that entire cost to the least affluent person in the apartment complex next door.
And by using state surpluses to backfill the lost revenue for local schools and services, it keeps them funded, even if that mechanism relies on a somewhat volatile funding source in the long run.
It is, simply put, the path of least resistance and maximum political gain with the minimum amount of immediate structural disruption.
This brings us to the final debate, the core philosophical question that's driving this entire policy battle. We've established the money has to come from somewhere. So the choice is fundamentally about which economic behavior we, as a society, choose to tax.
Exactly. Is it fairer to tax people on their wealth, what they own, even if the gain is unrealized, which is the property tax model, or on their spending what they consume, which is the sales tax model?
Property tax, as a wealth tax, it tends to be more progressive, at least in theory. Wealthier people own more valuable property, so they pay more.
But its primary flaw, as we discussed, is that it penalizes long-term stability, and it hits retirees who are asset-rich but cash-poor. It demands liquidity based on unrealized gains.
And on the other side, sales tax, especially a hyperinflated 20% rate, is inherently regressive.
It is. If I'm a billionaire, a 20% sales tax on a new couch is an insignificant nuisance. But if I'm a low-income worker, That 20% eats up a vastly larger, disproportionate chunk of my limited budget.
It hits necessities across the board.
The sales tax disproportionately penalizes those who have to spend nearly all of their income just to live.
What's fascinating is the perception of control. Property tax feels involuntary. You own the asset, you must pay the annual bill. But sales tax, at least in theory, feels voluntary. You choose when and what to spend on.
And that's the nuance the listener has to grasp. The voluntary nature of the consumption tax is its greatest political strength, even if the high rate makes it economically painful. The property tax, on the other hand, even when it's capped or exempted, allows for far better long-term budgeting for a homeowner.
While the high consumption tax just hides the cost of government in every single transaction you make.
It makes budgeting more difficult, and the true cost of government becomes invisible.
This has been a true deep dive into the hidden costs of what looks like financial freedom. We started with the dream of a zero-tax house.
The ultimate financial freedom.
And we conclude with the realization that the cost is just moved somewhere else, often to the most vulnerable people in the system, or it's simply hidden in the price of a gallon of milk.
The lesson here for you is to be skeptical. When a politician promises the elimination of your largest fixed bill, the replacement often comes with invisible, insidious, and potentially far more inequitable consequences.
So we'll leave you with this final, stark personal choice. This is the exact choice being posed by this 2026 political battleground. Knowing all the risks, would you accept a 20% sales tax on absolutely everything you buy, from food to furniture, clothing to cars, in exchange for paying zero property tax on your primary residence forever? Yes or no? We encourage you to reflect deeply on what that trade-off would truly mean for your monthly budget and for the social contract of your community.